All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 411 Ground and Pound MMA podcast, your weekly look into the wide, wacky, wonderful world of mixed martial arts. My name is Robert Winfrey, and I am your host. What do we got on the agenda this evening? So, UFC on ESPN Plus 105, or UFC Vegas 100, if you'd rather. That went down, and oy, that poor card. That poor card. We're going to talk about that. Probably not take too much time because not a whole lot there. We will also be previewing this Saturday UFC 309, which I will unfortunately not be able to cover live. I will try. I should have something written for that at some point. Before I talk about it, I'll have at least seen it. But I have a obligation on Saturday, and that's there are things more important than my coverage. So we'll leave that at the moment, and yeah, so that's what we got, and then. I kind of look. I'm not here to preach, but if I'm going to talk about anything in the news segment, I do have to address the elephant in the room of the United States presidential election. I promise not to foist political views, but this is non-trivially related to MMA, so I'm going to limit my discussion to that. And so, whatever your particular political preference is, hopefully I'm not abrasive or preachy, because politics occasionally does come up here on this show. I try very hard not to bring it up unless it's necessary. But when the UFC president is called up to give a few words at uh, at, the now president-elect's victory speech, I can't ignore that. I mean, I talked a little bit about Biden when he was elected because it was tangentially related to some MMA stuff, and this is a little bit closer than just tangentially related, but we'll sort that out. We're going to talk about it a little bit. I mean, I'm not going to sort out American politics here. That's a very different kind of show. But that's what we got. That's what we got right now, and we'll see what other news might happen while we're recording, but that's where we stand at the moment. So, if you could interact with the product a little bit, like, comment, subscribe, star rating, written review, y'all know the drill. Anything to help out the product is deeply appreciated by me. So, let's jump into this, shall we? UFC on ESPN Plus 105. Okay. Before we get to how the predictions did and everything, this poor card lost fights. Just dropped out left and right during fight week. Two in particular. We lost the original co-main event of Cody Garbrandt and Miles Johns. Then the replacement fight for that in the co-main, what they bumped up, was weird choice actually, for being honest. But Ricky Tercios and was that Sopai? I think it was Bernardo Sopai was his opponent. Yeah, that was scrapped after the weigh-ins. Um, Dalby fell out of the fight during fight week with Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, and we got a guy stepping in on absurdly short notice who missed weight. But you take a fight on 4 days' notice, I'm just not going to be. I'm not going to judge you very harshly for that. Uh, just so all of that went down. Just oh yeah, this poor card. I said last week, Magny and Protas is a fine fight, but a very poor main event. Largely, this kind of played out. There's a lot of finishes that we're going to talk about, but I'm going to explain when we get through some of the stuff why I don't think that's. I'm old enough to remember, and I've been around this sport long enough to remember. Um, Dana White criticizing Strikeforce at one point. They had had an event. I think it was not headlined by, but featured Robbie Lawler and Matt Lindland. There were other fights on that card too. That wasn't the main event. Again, it was like it wasn't even I think it was the featured bout, so third. But it was among others. There were a lot of finishes on that particular Strikeforce card. And Dana White got asked about it because at the time MMA journalism and media was not what it is now. And his response was, and this is actually a relatively savvy promotional maneuver, because the UFC event that was in proximity to that had a lot of decisions. And he was asked, that Strikeforce card had a bunch of finishes. And his response was, we could make fight cards like that if we wanted to. But that's not what we want to do. We want to when you put the best together, you don't always get stunning knockouts. I mean, we could still have Matt Lindland, and he was again to kind of dismiss. And in fairness, like I'm not here to bemoan or besmirch Matt Lindland. At the time of that fight, he was fairly washed as a competitor in MMA at least. And so his comment, like, yeah, we could make fight nights like that if we wanted to, but we don't. We want to have quality. I'm not saying he's completely correct in his assessment. The Lawler and Lindland fight, that was a very that's a fair observation about that fight. But that's kind of what we got here. In fact, let me do this before I get into the fights. There was only one underdog that won all night. Just one. When that's kind of how things play out, I don't consider that to be very like competitive matchmaking. Now, some of the fights were okay. I'm not here to yell at the fighters just have to take what they've got. Like you sign the fight, your job is not to care about the odds. Your job is to win the fight. But when you've got that many first round finishes, um, when you've got, the standing guillotine, which there was one, um, when you've got guys who just wilt after a few punches, and there were a couple of those, or you've got somewhat forgettable fights, like what wound up being the third fight. Um, Actually, a couple of fights on the main card. The Apart from the main event, this is largely indistinguishable from a regional MMA card. That may be a little bit disingenuous to Renier de Ridder and Gerald Meerschaert, Meerschaert's been around the UFC for a long time, so maybe outside the top two. Yeah, this is more akin to how regional MMA plays out than how elite MMA plays out in general. And you can maybe be entertained by that. I'm not saying I wasn't necessarily, but I don't watch the UFC for mismatches. I don't mind a little bit of freak show and a little bit of Carney in MMA. I really don't. But there wasn't even that. Like this is just kind of soulless, heartless machine assembly line MMA is what we had here. This was the last Apex card of the year, and they're going to be remodeling it at some point next year, so I don't know when exactly that goes into effect, but these were warehouse fights. And that's a presentation thing, more so than me saying all the fighters suck, because most of these fighters are not bad fighters. All right, with that little bit of soapbox out of the way, ultimately, after a couple of fights fizzled, and I switched my pick from Nicholas Dalby to Zaleski dos Santos because that was a close fight to predict anyway. Somebody stepping in on really short notice against him, that's just almost never gonna make that pick. Of the 11 fights, 9-2. Um, which one annoyed me that I got wrong? If I was gonna pick an underdog, I mean, I picked two underdog. I picked one underdog and one favorite of the two that I missed. If I was going to go with an underdog out of those two, I really should have gone with Gaston Bolaños. Just had a just probably a better pick than Cortavius Romeus, and certainly would have been better than picking Trocoli, who I think at this point I can conclude is just not very good. Um, yeah, other than that, yeah, 9-2, but this was not a hard card to predict. I mean, it just wasn't. I saw this was one of the first times I saw people pointing out like, man, of what happened here, I went 11-0. This was if you picked all favorites, you only lost one fight. So I wouldn't have don't parlay whole MMA cards, that's a recipe for disaster, but if you had made individual bets on each favorite, you only lose one of those. That's yeah, that's just a weird thing to me because I'm very used to MMA not going that way and seeing this play out that way. Yeah. Anyway, 9-2 overall. Um, probably should have gotten. I really should have gotten the Gore one right. Of all of them, that one I really should have trusted the odds makers a little bit more. Romeus and Bolaños, I thought the odds were a bit too wide. I think you heard me talk about that last week a little bit. Yeah. But I'll take 9-2. That brings me year to date to 321 and 137 for no contests. So, still doing pretty good. I don't think at this point it's not possible for me to have a negative year, so I am quite happy. That's really the only thing I wanted out of this when it was all said and done. So as for the fights themselves, only one's really worth talking about. Main event, Carlos Praches knocks out Neil Magny 450 of the first round. I can't remember the last time Neil Magny was actually slept. He's been stopped with strikes before. It's not the most common thing, but it's not uncommon. But I think the last time he got actually kind of knocked out, you might have to go back to like when he fought Santiago Ponzinibbio, which featured a number of eye pokes, and took into like the fourth round. I think it was not the first. We'll check when that was. Um, yeah, that was a little over halfway into the fourth, so that was 3.5 rounds it took. Michael Morales got the stoppage fairly in a little bit less time than this, but that was also kind of more overwhelming. Magny still had his faculties about him here. Praches put him to sleep. Praches fights off some early clinches. Magny did not want to strike with him for prolonged periods of time. Totally understandable, by the way. But he can't quite maintain the clinch for long enough periods of time. And the first time they kind of broke the clinch, Praches is a little bit of a slow starter. He doesn't take the whole round, but that first, 2 minutes, give or take, he's not usually out of first gear all that much. But when he gets going, man, he is terrifying. He hurt Magny pretty early with a right hook, because Magny was very preoccupied with the left hand, because Praches fights southpaw, was worried about the left hand. Understandable, his left hand is kind of his finishing. That's his dominant hand. That's the one that does the damage. But it meant that Magny was a little bit open with some of his choices to a right hook, and he got clipped. Prochas never let him really recover. He tried to clinch, got away from that, and then crushes him with a left hand. It doesn't look that bad in real time. It glances off the temple, but Magny drops like a marionette with the strings cut. Bonk, down, out, done. Heck of a performance from Prochas, who's gone 4-0 this year. All of them finishes in the UFC. He is one of the breakout stars for 2024. I don't know exactly where he's going to end on that list, but he is somewhere on that list. He has done some remarkable work, some genuinely remarkable work. After the fight, he said he wants to fight. He would like to fight on the upcoming Australia card. I think it's in Perth. Apparently, he has a child that lives there, so he wants to travel there, visit. And hey, God bless. No complaints there. He mentioned specifically Jack Della Maddalena. That seems like a bit of a reach. Magny was ranked 15th, and don't get me wrong, Prochas looked great. But JDM is like on the verge of a title shot. There seems to be a little bit of disparity there. So I'm not sure that's where I would go. Not that I complain about that fight, mind you. He said that or Jeff Neal. I like the Neal fight a little bit better, if I'm being honest. Neal had a pretty good win his last time out. He's coming off a win, right? I'm pretty sure. Let me check real fast. Yeah, he had there's the injury to Rafael dos Anjos. So, yeah, Neal, I would like to see. I think that fight makes a lot of sense. Neal, I think, is ranked number 10. And after this, Prochas will be somewhere like 13, 14, 15. Neal and Prochas makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm not, like I said, not going to complain if they make him and JDM, but I think Jack Della Maddalena is looking to fight up, not down. And I don't think that's unfair of him at this point. Prochas similarly looking to fight up, but his second option was the Jeff Neal fight seems more doable. I don't need to see him fight. I already mentioned the guy, but Michael Morales is the other rising welterweight guy at the moment. Some people have suggested putting them together. I don't think that's necessary at this juncture. Let them keep going. Their meeting feels kind of inevitable, but there's no need to rush it. So heck of a win for Prochas. He's one of the breakout guys I already mentioned. Sucks for Magny. This is his first losing streak in a long time. In fact, this is his first losing streak since Since his UFC debut, basically, in 2013. So 13, wins his debut, loses his next two. And so, yeah, since the end of 2013, that man has never had a losing streak. Till now. I'm not trying to insult Neil Magny, but he's 42. He's got 42 fights. Excuse me, he's not 42 years old. 42 fights, and he's 37. And he's been in the UFC for like 11 years. Almost 12. His UFC debut was February of 13. 12 years in the UFC is incredibly difficult. I think he's pretty clearly past the point of like making a legitimate run. But he's been a stern test for rising guys, and he might still be able to do that, but I think he's pretty definitively out of the contendership queue. Even the bottom half of it. And Prochas in the future is going to be a real problem for guys. That man has power and a good delivery system, and he fights out of a good team. The Fighting Nerds, man, that camp is going to be... They're another thing that really kind of burst onto the scene this year and made a lot of noise. So your co-main event became the UFC debut of former 2-weight world champion over in one, Rainier de Ridder and Gerald Meerschaert. RDR wins via arm triangle choke, 144 the third. This fight looked exactly how you think it might. Um, some awkward striking from both guys. Meerschaert slightly better hands in general. But de Ridder had a pretty decent jab that bothered him a little bit. He dropped Meerschaert coming out of a clinch at the end of the first. The grappling was kind of what you were here to look for from these two guys, and in fairness, there's some really nice transitional work, scrambles, and blocks from both guys. The finishing sequence in particular. De Ridder grabs a front headlock. Meerschaert goes to peek out. He blocks it with a knee. Swing. That's another thing really good sequence before he catches the arm triangle choke. This one, it's a bit grueling. It's a little sloppy. Both guys are used to. I don't mean this unkindly, but if you look at their setups for submissions, a lot of them are. Gimmicky is a strong word, but they're used to catching people by surprise. And against each other, they did a lot of, de Ridder in particular, you can see him setting up things that he would normally hit on lesser opposition, and it just doesn't even really get close most of the time with Meerschaert. So when the thing ends, he actually just goes back to very, very simple stuff. Um, Simple stuff, very well executed. So this one's probably worth your time if you like some of the grappling exchanges. And de Ridder, I don't know what his upper ceiling will be. I mean, his striking is rough. There's some good elements to it, but on whole, on like the totality of it is just a little bit rough still. His grappling is quite good, but his takedowns need a bit of work. You can see why what he was doing got him a lot of success on smaller, I'm not even going to say smaller shows, but against a certain level of opposition. But I mean, I remember both of his fights with Malakin, and I'm not going to talk about Malakin and Rug because that fight was just absolutely god awful. You can see like when his game when he can't suck you into the grappling, a lot of what he does, the rest of it just kind of falls apart. But he got a win, and he made an interesting observation. De Ridder did in the build-up to this that Gerald Meerschaert's a good opponent, very good test, but he thought he needed a finish because he wants to make a statement about where he can go in the division because um, only top guys finish Meerschaert. Now that's not strictly speaking. That's not the most literal of truths, but the sentiment is true. And if you look at the guys who actually finish Meerschaert, it's Ian Heinisch didn't pan out. Kamzat, Joe Pyfer, Jack Hermanson, and Thiago Santos are the only guys who have finished him in the UFC. And Santos, was ranked at middleweight, went on to move up to light heavyweight. Hermanson was a top guy for a while. I think he's still decently ranked. Shemaev might be fighting for the belt soon, and Pyfer's a guy that they clearly have pretty decent hopes for. So getting a finish over him, I do think I think he made a salient observation there about if I want to prove that I have good potential, I can't just beat him. I really do need to finish him. I don't know. The first shock of your UFC the step up in competition can be a real thing. And this was De Ritter's first time actually at 185 in a little bit. So I'm not trying to dump on the guy. You know, he got a win. It's a watchable fight, but he's going to run into some real problems real fast if he doesn't take the appropriate lessons from this fight, even though he won. Gaston Bolaños, our only underdog of the night to cash, defeated Cortavius Romius via unanimous decision, a 30-26, which I don't agree with. Two 30-27s. I'm fine with that. Romius looked. He had good moments, but looked very much like a guy not comfortable in there for big stretches of this fight. Very much like a guy not really. You can tell fighters when everything is like clicking for them. It doesn't mean it all looks the same, but there is an air there about fighters once they understand themselves and their game and everything really kind of harmonizes. Romius very much not there. Bolaños with some nice 12-6 elbows actually. He was so Romius had his back, but Bolaños had put Romius's back on the mat, so he still has his back taken, but he's the one with height. He scoots his hips back through the hooks of Romius and then lands some 12-6 elbows to the head. Like, yes, please. That's how that's one of the ways that's supposed to be used. So more of that, please. Let's see. Jillian Robertson beat Luana Pinheiro via unanimous decision. There was a 29-27. That 10-8 feels very generous. The two 29-28s for Robertson are fine. Robertson wins the first, Pinheiro the second, Robertson the third. Not a whole lot to unpack there. In kicking off the main card, Mansour Abdul Malik defeated Dushko Todorovic via TKO. Hit a really nice knee, actually, out of a clinch. And some punches. Yeah. Prelims, Denise Gomes defeated Karolina Kowalkiewicz via unanimous decision, 230-27 to 29-28. I knew Kowalkiewicz was older, but dude, she's 15 years older than Gomes. Gomes still looks to have some cardio issues. Even if she won the third round, which I kind of thought she did, but you could make the argument for Kowalkiewicz. The third round is not her friend. That's something she can work on, but it's definitely a thing at the moment. Zach Scroggin once again, stepped in on like 3-4 days notice. Missed weight, weighed 174 for the welterweight fight. I'm not going to judge him too harshly for that. Elijah Zaleski dos Santos stopped him with punches in a minute and 15 seconds. They traded a few early calf kicks, and then Zaleski dos Santos was like, okay, I'm done with this, and started punching him in the head, and he kind of fell over. Charles Radke got back on the winning side of things, stopped Matthew Semmelsberger with punches in 51 seconds. Semmelsberger might just be shot at this point. He's got good power, but his chin is questionable. His defense has never been great. And some of his in-fight decision-making that's always been another problem of his. Bantamweight Damon Blackshear got a pretty decent rear naked choke over Cody Stamann, 4:19 of the first. And just solid overall performance from Blackshear. Hit a really nice combination of punches that hurt Stamann, got Stamann shooting. Sprawled, got the back. Had to work for it a little bit, but ultimately did get the choke locked in. Trishan Gore defeated Antonio Trocoli via guillotine choke, the standing guillotine choke. 123 of the first. I hate to be this guy, but if your defense against a standing guillotine is as poor as Trocoli's was, you shouldn't be in the UFC. And kicking everything off, Melissa Mullins missed weight. Second time in a row she's missed weight. She beat Claudia Seguya via TKO 120 of the second, excuse me. Really sedate first round until Mullins gets on top, and then she kind of got going in the second, got a takedown, got a decent position. Enough unanswered punches to prompt the stoppage. Not great, but Mullins I don't think is going to be, I shouldn't be too declarative about this. There's still a lot of work to do on her game, and I'm not sure at what pace that's proceeding. That's not saying it isn't, not saying it can't. I'm just saying her game still looks a little one-dimensional. And that was it. Only 11 fights. The pacing for this card was kind of rough. I understand that when you have a bunch of relatively early finishes, sometimes you're going to have to stretch for time. But they played a lot of the same hype video for UFC 309. And they basically had enough time to go to the analyst desk between each fight. They just had nothing to do with a lot of the airtime. There was no fight of the night. Fair enough. Performances of the night went to Carlos Praches, Mansour Abdul-Malik, Charles Radke, and Damon Blackshear. Oh, no problems with that. I might have maybe gone DeRitter over Blackshear, but maybe. Those are all fine choices. So that was that. Full report, MMAZona411mania.com. You all know the drill about that. So go give it a read if you're so inclined. I always appreciate anything you're able to do on that front. All right. I mentioned I won't be covering this live, but let's do the preview anyway. UFC on ESPN. UFC 309. The UFC is in Madison Square Garden, and they've brought wrong button. The main event. This was supposed to be the main event a year ago. I don't want to. I shouldn't say that. I don't really feel like completely clowning this card or this fight, but it does bear noting that this is not an especially strong pay-per-view card. I have almost no interest in Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. Just being honest with you guys there. Very little interest in that. I was kind of against this a year ago. The fact that we've now waited this long, this is a novelty fight. You've got, in fairness to Jon, maybe the best the sport's ever seen. And you got Miocic, the most successful heavyweight champion the UFC's had. But of the possible Jones opponents, as a fan and as an observer, Stipe is the least interesting of the three major choices. So, here's the other thing about this. If anything happens to either of these guys, neither one of them is going to fight Tom Aspinall on short notice. I mean, almost certainly not. Look, I don't pick against Jon Jones very often. I did for the Gone fight, and I felt incredibly stupid. I felt stupid that whole week leading up to that fight. If I had the same policy in place now where I can I give myself an opportunity to change my mind on things. I mean, I wasn't keeping track last year the same way I was this year, but I would have changed my mind the next morning and never looked back. And I have a lot of respect for Stipe, his success. He has been I really appreciate that he has just kind of eschewed all elements of the fight game that he does not like. He trains hard, he fights hard, but all the extraneous BS, he just doesn't seem to have time for it. And if that's genuinely your position, then okay. The fact that he doesn't do a lot of interviews doesn't seem like he's, pissy at the media or has his feelings hurt or anything like that. It's just he doesn't like doing it in general. So he doesn't. I mean, I remember after he became champion, um, he did an episode of pardon me. He did an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, right? One of the most It's not the most awkward conversation Joe Rogan's had on that show, but if you know how to read conversations, he's very clearly just not all that comfortable. I don't mean that he's like boring or uninteresting, but just look at how that conversation doesn't flow. It's a little bit staccato. It's not a ball kind of being volleyed. And it's just not really his thing. His thing is fighting and firefighting and being there for his family. And God bless him. Those are so much more important. Um, but so what I'm about to say, the rest of the following should really not be construed as me like dismissing him or his ability or his body of work in the UFC, which has been said the most successful heavyweight champion the UFC's ever had. I don't call him the best heavyweight the UFC's ever had because I don't think he is. I think Francis pretty definitively answered that question. I think he's still behind some of the guys who had their runs in Pride, like Fedor or Big Nog, but I think he is probably somewhere in the top 8 best heavyweights the sport's ever produced. I don't think he's better than Kane. Best version of Kane, I don't think that goes very well for Stipe. But I'm not here talking about like heavyweight rankings, okay? But here's part of the big reason I'm picking Jon Jones. I know he's coming off of injury, but do you guys remember the last time Stipe Miocic fought? Because I do. It was when he lost to Francis Ngannou in 2021, March of 21. He hasn't had a fight at all in 3.5 years. And the last time we did see him, he was violently knocked out. I don't know, once again, I don't know if you guys remember that fight. Look up the finish, if nothing else. That was scary. The last time he won a fight was August of 2020, when he won the trilogy fight with Daniel Cormier. I That kind of layoff is just I have a hard time picking anyone to beat Jon Jones. I have a really hard time picking a guy to beat Jon who hasn't fought in 3 years, was violently knocked out the last time we saw him. And even at his best, I don't think I would pick to beat Jon. Now, I don't mean to say that it's impossible for Stipe Miocic to win this fight. He's a good fighter. He's got power, legitimate heavyweight, can wrestle. We've seen him go 5 rounds. Anyone completely dismissing Stipe here is making a grave error, I think, to completely dismiss him. But He's also he's at a reach disadvantage. Hang on, I'm trying to remember how much. His reach is 80. Yeah, so he's at 4.5 inch reach disadvantage. The is Stipe actually 6'4"? I think he's listed as such. Yeah. I'm they're both listed at 6'4". I think Jones is taller, but we'll see when we get closer, when they actually like square up. John's offensive potency has kind of faded over the course of his career. If you remember his early run, man, he was a dynamo, and I do remember because I was here for it. He's not that anymore, and that's not the end of the world, but too much time boxing, I think, will give John some problems. But Jon Jones thus far, has had not only superb defense, but on the occasion people do penetrate his defense, I've never seen him hurt. I've seen him hit. I've never seen Jon Jones like rocked. Now, Stipe has a good delivery mechanism for his power, so if that's going to shift, here is not the craziest place for it to happen. But here's the other thing about this. John's offensive wrestling, it lost some of its potency at light heavyweight. I think there's some reasons for that. Some of that, the level and style of opposition he faced. This guy's got more and more tape on him. Some of his strategic choices changed a little bit. And I think he may have been, like, some minor injuries have just kind of contributed to remove a little bit of the dynamism from that. At heavyweight, though, Stipe's usually been able to be the one out wrestling people. I don't know how that looks if Stipe's the one on his back. When was the last time somebody actually took him down? I mean, Cormier did. And he survived under Cormier, but Cormier also never. Those fights are so weird. They're just kind of. I don't mean that like bad. I mean they're just weird. Like Cormier out wrestles Stipe in the first round of both of the second and third fights, the two he loses, and then just like never really goes back to it. Some of it is Stipe kind of making a few adjustments about distance closing, but Cormier doesn't really make a concerted effort to engage in the wrestling after that first round. Which is weird. I mean, it might be an energy management thing. I don't know, but I know he doesn't really do it. John, the other thing about this, John's ground and pound is significant. If we're like comparing John and Cormier's pure takedowns are better than John's. At heavyweight, they've demonstrated to be, at least. John out wrestled Cormier when they fought both times, but that's another thing. There was a lot, but John's submission threat is higher than Cormier's, and frankly, Jon Jones's ground and pound is much more damaging than Daniel Cormier's. Cormier had good power. I'm not knocking the guy. This is not. I'm trying to draw a parallel about how the fight might go. Some of the positions that Cormier had Stipe in, if John gets Stipe in those positions or similar ones, he closes the show. Now, whether he chooses to wrestle that heavily or not remains to be seen. But ultimately, I've got to pick John here. I do think the odds might be playing with a little bit of fire. You're offering like plus 500 on Stipe. I can see why they're that heavy, but I would not feel very confident in that setup. Co-main event. This is your other good fight on this card. After this, things are going to take a pretty serious downturn. Not completely. There's a few things on here, that are okay, but we're talking pay-per-view quality. Like, it's not really here. It's these two fights, and if something happens to the main event, if something happens to one of those two and the other one says, no, I'm not fighting Tom Aspinall on short notice, I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, they'll probably call Alex Pereira, but, like, there's nothing else here you could elevate to main event and expect it to, like, actually sell. Anyway, co-main event, which is just a preface to say, I like the co-main event just fine. It's not a pay-per-view main event at this point. Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler rematching. Michael Chandler's been sitting out for like 2 years at this point. Yeah, his last fight was November of 22. Wasted the last like 2 years of his physical prime on a McGregor pipe dream. Not a pipe dream. There's got to be a better analogy than that, but I can't think of it off the top of my head for just being like strung along like he was. Anyway, the last time these two fought, Chandler had a really good first round, but then got finished in the second by Oliveira. Oliveira was last seen having a tough fight with Arman Tsarukyan. I don't think Oliveira is going to wind up wearing the belt again. I mean, even if he'd beaten Tsarukyan, I don't think he beats Islam Makhachev. If those two fought again, I think he might do better than their first fight. But even the best version of Charles Oliveira, Islam Makhachev, is just a bad matchup for him. I think this fight probably looks very similar to their first one. I don't know what each guy might have done differently since then that would make me think something radically has changed. Chandler's got good power, hard-nosed fighter. Gonna give Oliveira some problems early, but if he can't get Oliveira out of there on the back of that, he's gonna fade, and Oliveira is still supremely dangerous. So I'm going with Oliveira. I think the odds on this one are about right, actually. Um, Most places have Oliveira around like plus 250. I think that's about right. Next, and this is where the quality takes a steep drop. I'm not trying to knock any of the rest of these fights, okay? But this is a two-fight card, and really only the main event is like set down, pay a lot of money to see. But next up, I can't say you'd crown the next title challenger out of this because it's got to be Manon Fior. But you have two rising, you have two pretty serious talents at women's flyweight. You have Viviane Araújo, who's had some success, but is also 1-3 in her last four. Now, granted, Alexa Grasso, Amanda Ribas, Natalia Silva, those are good fighters. But she's fighting Karine Silva, who seems to be someone the UFC is kind of like given the push. Silva is on a very long, like an 8-9 fight winning streak overall. Hang on. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, 9. That includes 4 wins in the UFC, 3 of those finishes. She's taking a step up. Her last opponent was Ariane Lipski. Araujo is better than Lipski, but Karine Silva seems to be the one that the UFC is kind of behind. And it's not very difficult to see why. So, not a whole lot of problems going for Silva here. Araujo, it's not impossible for her to win this fight. If Silva can really put some heat on you, that's when she tends to shine. She struggled a little bit with that with Lipski. Ultimately did still get the win, but she's ascending the ladder rapidly, and when you do that rapidly, some of the holes in your game or the conditions for your success are no longer met rather suddenly, and how you react to that can be a big deal. I still favor her here, but worth noting as we can keep a look at an eye on Silva going forward. Middleweights, Bo Nickel and Paul Craig. Paul Craig is so weird. I say this with respect. He could beat. His game is weird enough, and it is possible for him to beat pretty much anyone on the roster. You could match him with anyone, and there's a bunch I would never pick him to win, but I would not be like shocked and shaken if he caught a triangle on a bunch of them, or something similar. By the same token, he can lose to anyone on the roster, from a top guy all the way down to, somebody making their debut. If somebody debuted and beat him up and got a win, like, would you be shocked? In a weird, and I say that with respect. Um, but that's kind of where I think he is. Bo Nickel had a little bit of a rougher time out his last time when he. And I scrolled a little too far. And he beat Cody Brundage. He's going to have to mind his P's and Q's because he's going to be able to get Craig down. The question is whether or not he can do a bunch of damage on the feet maybe to facilitate that, and then that'll mess with Craig's ability to grapple. But you can't be lax about being in Craig's guard. You can't do that. I still have no real problem picking Nickel, but as mentioned, Craig winning this would not surprise me all that much. And kicking off the main card, we have at lightweight Mauricio Hufi. I know he's Brazilian, but I don't remember if he prefers to actually pronounce the R like an R or like an H. He might just be Rufi. Against James Yontop. So Rufi 10-1, another one of these guys out of the Fighting Nerds. Looked pretty, got a 5-fight winning streak, had a really solid UFC debut when he beat Jamie Malarkey. I don't have a lot of reason to pick against him here. I'm not trying to insult Yontop, but he's 14-4, and he's 0-2 in the UFC. Losses to Chris Padilla and Vyacheslav Borshev. You could argue that Borshev fight for him, maybe. I think I scored that for Borshev. Anyway, I don't think he's being brought in to be an easy fight for Hoofy, but I need a really solid reason to pick against the Fighting Nerds at this point, and I don't think Yontop provides that. So that's your pay-per-view card. If anything happens to that main event, they're in real trouble. Anyway, rest of the card. Actually, a pretty good fight here. Jonathan Martinez coming off of that loss to Jose Aldo and Marcus McGee. I'm a pretty decent believer in both of these guys. Martinez had a really nice winning streak going before Aldo. Unfortunately, there's now enough tape on him that people have figured out a little bit of his game. Marcus McGee, I have been non-trivially impressed with for a while now. 9-1, 5-fight winning streak, 3-0 in the UFC. Easily, this is a non-trivial step up in class for him. His last two, because he debuted on short notice up at featherweight and beat Journey Newson. Then cut down to bantamweight where he is better suited. He beat J.P. Bays and he beat Gaston Bolaños. Martinez is a big step up from those two guys. I don't think that should be insulting to them. This is a big step up for him. This is a winnable fight for him. Jonathan Martinez is a very powerful kicker, but if you can pressure him in the pocket, he doesn't. He's got pretty good hands, but he doesn't. He seems to be thinking a lot in the pocket instead of having a lot of things really. Uh, Pressure that he is unfamiliar with is not his friend, and closer quarter striking doesn't seem to favor him a whole lot. Now, his kicking game in general and his mobility, those have done him a world of good thus far. Could easily carry him to victory here. Um, a big part of the question is like, is he going to have learned from the Aldo fight? Because Aldo, a lot of what Aldo did is stuff that is theoretically repeatable. Aldo did not beat him with like Jose Aldo magic. He beat him with a really good game plan, a really solid understanding of what makes Martinez good, mitigating or removing that, and then making him go to like the next layers of his game, which are uh, not as potent. McGee's a smart fighter. The odds on this one are really close. The odds actually lean just a little bit towards McGee. I'm gonna lean towards Martinez here. Um, Let me asterisk this one. I need to I need to rewatch the Aldo fight because I haven't seen it in a little bit, and I need to see McGee's like most recent couple of fights. But this is a big step up. Is kind of the other reason I might be leaning towards Martinez. Middleweight, Chris Weidman and Eric Anders. I mean, we're in New York, so hey, here's Chris Weidman. He's still our boy, right? Um, Eric Anders, I don't think should be in the UFC at this point. I mean, he's coming off a win, but he lost to Marc-Andre Barrio before that. I don't know. They're trying to give Weidman a win in his home state. Is really what this breaks down to. And there's not a lot of people I would pick Chris Weidman to win a fight with at this point. But Eric Anders is, in fact, one of the people I actually feel okay picking. Uh, Odds are with Anders. Are we really. Okay. I understand why. I'm going to be very clear about this. Hang on. You know what? I'm not going to break this one down by technique. Okay? Because both guys are kind of washed. What I have to break this down by is how cruel do I think the MMA gods are? Eric Anders hasn't. I said he is coming off of a win. I'm not trying to take that away from him, but Jamie Pickett is not that great. He beat Kyle Dawkins a couple of years ago. Uh, I'm because it's like the Alabama boy and Eric Anders. I think he's from Alabama. Where's he from? I know he went to school there, college. He was technically born in the Philippines. Okay. Texas. Okay. Um, so, but Southern boy, if nothing else, coming into New York and knocking out a guy that has a fair amount of fan support still. That is the kind of thing that happens a lot in MMA. It just does. Weidman didn't look too bad against Silva, but Silva's also He also had to poke Bruno Silva in the eye repeatedly, and Bruno Silva himself, like that fight, I know it went the distance with Alex Pereira, and he actually had a few moments where he fought okay against him, but the beating Pereira put on him has seemed to have altered the trajectory of his career in a non-trivial way. Do I think Anders is that washed? Southpaw thing's kind of a component of this. Uh, Anders just has no real cardio, and I know that that's not a problem Weidman's ever really had. He's always in shape for the distance. Am I really gonna pick Chris Weidman? I'm talking myself into it. Uh, I'm gonna asterisk this one again, but because if I wake up tomorrow and just think, really, you picked Chris Weidman, I might change my mind on that. But let me lean Weidman just a little bit at the moment. This is a win. Let me put it this way. This is a very winnable fight for him, and if he badly loses, he should really not do this anymore. And kicking off the featured preliminary portion of the card at lightweight, Jim Miller and Damon Jackson. Jackson moving up to lightweight. Normally he fights at featherweight. Lost to Stipe Miocic his last time out. He's I kind of like Jackson, but I don't pick against Jim Miller. It's purely sentimental. Picking against him, picking him to beat Bobby Green was quite foolish. And Bobby Green did a number on him in that fight, but he stuck it out. Um, yeah, it's a little bit sentimental. I'm actually curious what the odds are. Odds like Jackson just a little bit. Understandable. I'm still going with Miller. I just this is the kind of fight he can win, and yeah, I just root for Jim Miller, and I freely admit my emotional blind spot in this regard. Don't take my betting advice on that one, to the extent that I give betting advice. Heavyweight, Marcin Tybura and Janata Deniz. Okay. Tybura coming off of a loss to Sergey Spivak. He beat Taito Ivasa before that and got run over by Tom Aspinall before that. Deniz, undefeated, 2-0 in the UFC. I mean, Austin Lane and Carl Williams. And the Williams fight was weird. Like, for some reason, Williams decided just not to wrestle him. A quick look at something here. Tabora could just kind of smother him. It's very possible that the more experienced guy is able to just bring that to bear. How washed is Tabora? I don't think he's that washed. He's 39. Just turned 39. He's clearly on the downside of it. This is going to come down to kind of how he chooses to fight. If he chooses to just strike with Deniz, he's going to lose. If he chooses to be smart about it, he can win this fight. Let me lean towards Deniz at the moment. I don't feel very good about that, though. Welterweight's next. Mickey Gall and Ramiz Brahimaj. Jeez. Gall's on a 3-fight losing streak because he started fighting better fighters. And Brahimaj, Been up and down in the UFC, 2-3, trading wins and losses the whole way. In fact, he's traded wins and losses his last several fights, even outside the UFC. His wins in the UFC are over Sasha Paletnikov and Michael Gilmore. Okay, so do I think Mickey Gall is better than those two guys? Because his losses are to Max Griffin, Court McGee, and Tembo Garimbo. Boy, do I not feel. I don't have. Gall got into the UFC way, way, way too early. He has. His skill development has lagged pretty far. I'm not trying to be unkind when I say that. But Brahima is also. Is Mickey Gall better than Sasha Paletnikov? And maybe like on par with Tembo Garimbo. Gall's in-fight decision making is still a little baffling to me. All right, let me go with Gall. If he loses this one, he's got to be gone. Like an 0-4 streak, all things considered for him, has just got to be it. Welterweights next up, Basel Hafez and Oban Elliott. You know, this is actually not the world's worst fight. Hafez 9-4-1, 1-1 in the UFC. Had a tough fight with Jack Della Maddalena on short notice and gave gave him some problems, especially early. I thought JDM won the fight, but Hafez acquitted himself well and then very handily beat Mickey Gall. Elliott 11-2, 2-0 in the UFC. Wins over Val Woodburn. It was a solid UFC debut, and then Preston Parsons. That was less inspiring from Elliott. I don't have much of a problem leaning towards Hafez here. Odds are actually with Elliott. Huh. Might have to rewatch that fight, his last one. I might be misremembering. But I actually like Hafez's chances. So I'll go with him. I'm picking too many underdogs. This is going to go badly. And kicking everything off. Okay, so allegedly there's two more fights here. Nikita Krylov was supposed to fight Azamat Murzakanov. That fell apart. Krylov is still kind of listed, so we'll see if they find somebody. And David Onama was supposed to fight Lucas Almeida. Almeida fell out. My hunch is at this point, we just have what we have. But Krylov, I have no problem picking in the dark. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's going to depend a little bit on who they get, but in general, picking Krylov under these conditions, I think is. I would have picked Murzakanov to beat him. Not by a whole lot, but by enough. But Krylov against random light heavyweight guy is usually going to go Krylov's way. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, we've already got 12 fights. I don't know that we need to go to 14. Anyway, so those two may or may not, at this point I think probably not, but kicking everything off, women's flyweight, Veronica Hardy and Eduarda Mora. Hardy's actually been doing some pretty decent work lately. 3-1 in her last, sorry, 4-1 in her last 5, miscounted. 3-fight winning streak. Nothing that's really making you run, right home, but performing quite ably. Mora, 10-1, 1-1 in the UFC, coming off of a loss to Denise Gomes. She missed weight in both of her fights. Good grief. Well, those were down. Okay, those were down at strawweight. So they made her move up to flyweight. That tracks. Um, I don't know how Mora will handle not being able to be just a weight bully. And Hardy's technique has come up a lot. Let me go with Hardy, actually. I need to see how Mora looks in this weight class. She might surprise people and get the win, but I'll go with Hardy at the moment. And that is what we got for the moment. So, no live coverage from me. I don't know if someone else will be handling that over at the MMA Zone. I will have some kind of write-up or report written up for it at some point after the event. And I will certainly watch the relevant fights before we get to the podcast next week, which I will still be recording. All right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about politics, shall we? And I promise I will make this as brief as I can. But we had the presidential election here in the United States last week, and by a significant margin, winning both the Electoral College and the popular vote, Donald Trump will be the 47th President of the United States, the first president to serve non-consecutive terms since Grover Cleveland. And yeah, on a purely personal note, I'm not going to talk about my personal politics here. Okay? Just heads up. I know people who are happy with this outcome. I know people who are very not happy with the outcome. Um, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about, again, my stances on any of this. Um, except maybe to say the following. I think the Harris campaign was comically inept. There were several things that they did that just baffled me. Um, Not saying that, the Trump campaign was flawless, but it was significantly more focused. It was significantly more dialed in. And the big thing that it had going for it, and this is a weird statistical thing if you track this stuff, all over the world, because this was a big year for elections, like of the major democratic governments around the world. I think almost all of them had major elections this year. Not all of them work on the same cycle as the U.S., so they don't always sync up. They did this year. In fact, Canada I think Canada has theirs coming up very shortly. And all over the world, incumbent parties are getting the boot. Doesn't really matter. Um, that doesn't track left or right. It's not like all the left ones got the boot or all the right ones got the boot. It's whichever group was in power when this election cycle came around, they just got no. Um, so it was just a really bad election cycle for incumbents globally, not just here in the United States. And I know there's a handful of minor exceptions to that, but in general, just a really, really, really bad time to try and be retaining office. I mean, let's be real. For a lot of places, this was the first major election post-COVID. And I'm not here to talk at length about how any place handled that because some places, nobody seemed to have a really good idea about it. And some places handled it better than others. And frankly, here in the United States, there's a lot of things that there's some stuff about how we tried to handle the recovery that worked relatively well on a comparative scale, I think like of the G7 countries, we actually had one of the better post-COVID recoveries. But that's like macro level graphs and spreadsheet stuff that doesn't really translate. I don't mean like doesn't really translate informationally. Inflation here still sucks. It's not the worst it's ever been, but the trend over the last like 3 years of it has been bad. And I know like the last little bit it's gone down, but it's still, the trend is still upwards. So it kind of breaks down to, I'm going to use exaggerated numbers here for the sake of discussing it, but like if 2 years ago you had 3% inflation and last year you had another 4% inflation, and this year you decreased inflation by 3%, you've still had 4% inflation, give or take. That's grossly oversimplified and not huge, not entirely accurate, but think about the trend. The trend is still inflated, and dude, if people are struggling to afford groceries, they're going to look at whoever's in charge and give them the boot. And that may not always be fair. The president, and we're talking the United States, the president bears a weird relationship to the general state of the economy because they can't actually control a lot of it. But they will all crow up and down about how if it's good, it's our economy, and if it's bad, well, here's all these complicating factors. You don't get to do that. If you're going to take the good, you get to take the bad. You know, the old saying, you pick up one end of a stick, you pick up the other, right? Whole thing comes with you. And I don't, and so anyway, I promised I wouldn't talk too much politics, so we're going to move on to why I think this is important to include. Anyway, suffice to say, with a lot of incumbents, a lot of Democratic incumbents here in the United States did not sustain re-election. So the Republican Party has actually, the White House has a Senate majority. I don't remember the last count. There's some places, God help us, there are some states, including the one I live in, still counting ballots, which is pathetic. The state of Florida was thoroughly, humiliatingly shamed for the 2000 presidential election. This is the one where Florida was the state that decided things. And this was the first Bush and Gore, Gore and Bush, right? Vice President Al Gore, George W. Bush. Florida winds up deciding the election, and their process is put under a microscope because it takes forever to hash it out. Ultimately, Bush wins, for better or for worse. But Florida elections were a joke. I don't know if y'all were alive enough to remember this, or if you live in another country, maybe you don't care at all, but that state was a punchline for 3 years. 3.5, really. It was a punchline. And thankfully, the people in Florida kind of went, okay, we don't like this. Let's fix it. Somehow, that state is able to accurately handle the ballots, handle the voting process, with very few exceptions, in the span of about 4 hours. I don't know what those people did down there, but unless there be an accusation that it's all unduly partisan or crooked, it's really not. Like, that's not a... It's a state that has moved deep red, but for quite a few years, that was a swing state. And there were but the machinery of the Florida election process has been very smooth for quite a while now. And then there's other places that still couldn't find an appropriate count with both hands on a flashlight. I mean, just no. It's embarrassing, and it's again, it's more than a little bit pathetic. But point there. Um, I don't know if they got to 55 Senate seats for the Republican Party, but I know they have north of 50. So they have a clear majority, and I believe they have a clear majority in the House. Um, some of those are still, as I said, some of those are still being counted, and frankly, some of those are just very, very tight races. So I don't know. Some of those may have been called off to double check, but I don't care enough to look at the minutia of different congressional districts for other states all the time. Like I keep track of the general number, but the minutia of it, I don't get paid to do that, so I don't. But this is so all that is in favor of Donald Trump. And limiting this to MMA, there's a few things that I think are going to become a little bit relevant. One, there's a number of fighters who may have had trouble getting into the United States. That's probably not going to be a problem anymore. Khamzat Chimaev being maybe the most obvious example, but not the only one. I don't think that sanctions against Kadyrov will be lessened. I may be wrong about that, but my hunch is there's still going to be issues with Chechnya for very well documented reasons at this point. But some of how that is applied to individual fighters from that region of the world might change a little bit. We'll see. That's a big one. Other big ones, the NLRB. If so, not exactly a fan of Joe Biden. Let me just say that, and that should not be a oh no, you're a horrible Republican. I am not party affiliated. I'm not registered with any political party here in the United States. I know plenty of liberals and Democrats are not exactly thrilled with a bunch of what Joe Biden did. So just start there. Hardly a universally beloved president. But one of the things that I think it was a goal of his administration. I think it's one of the things they actually succeeded at. Their version of the NLRB has been busy and is very pro-labor, very pro-union. Which at different times, I've said this on the podcast before, and I'm not going to go deeply into it. I think that the ability to have organized labor is a good thing. I think if you take that away, it's a problem. I think if you also believe that every union is always in the right, you need to have a good look in the mirror because organized labor has a lot of ties to organized crime, and that's not an accident. Unions can be every bit as abusive and oppressive as management can. Doesn't mean they shouldn't exist. It means, like most things, there's complication and modulating that needs to be done. I can't imagine the Trump administration having an NLRB that is quite as favorable to labor as the Biden one is, and that's uh, that's not always a bad thing. As I said, I've seen plenty of abusive unions. I've seen plenty of abusive companies and managers too, and ideally you have a very large company and a very large union, and they just kind of beat the crap out of each other. Frequently, you get unions trying to crack down on smaller organizations, or you get management that is like, no, there will be no unionizing ever, and we will, do what we can to try and. This is one of those things it's just complicated. On balance, I think organized labor is good, but I think it's naive or unbearably biased to pretend that it is universally good. That there are not scummy applications of it or terrible people that get involved in it. Because, and, or that, frankly, some of the considerations and objectives of the union are averse to the what might be best for the broader country, and the union's job is just to represent its members, so I understand that. But I mean, by way of example, like longshoremen here in the United States, that is kind of a mess. Automation could fix a lot of it, and it's not really going to happen for a while because the unions don't want their people out of work. I understand that, but when you look at how smoothly other ports run, you look at some of ours, like, oi. So the NLRB is something to keep an eye on. Again, is there anything else? There were some people kind of circulating the idea that because Dana White got up and said a few words at Trump's victory speech. Hey, is Dana White going to get into politics? There's not, let me put it this way, not on the national stage. Not on the national stage. He might make a play for governor of Nevada if he lives there. I think he still lives in Nevada. He might make a play for governor. That would not be wholly outside the realm of possibility, but I kind of doubt any higher than that. And even then, it's not like he is beloved. I know Nevada went for Trump this time, but it's not like Nevada is a profoundly red state. It's not. It's swing. Went for Biden last time. So it's not one of these states where just having the right letter next to your name guarantees victory. And there's a lot of those. And I know I live in one. I'm not even saying it's always the worst thing in the world, but the closer you get to uniparty or one-party rule, usually the worst things are as a general rule. So my point there being like, I don't think he's going to go any higher than, he might try for governor if he's really tempted by it, but then he's going to have to, you can't just demagogue your way through a state gubernatorial election. He'd have to answer for a lot of things, and he'd have to answer questions from media that is not complimentary, and I don't think he wants that headache. I mean, the man's already got boatloads of money. I don't know if he wanted to try it out. I do think again, he wouldn't do a state level like government. He wouldn't be part of the state legislature. He'd either run for a congressional seat or the governorship. I don't think he'd try for the Senate. But again, he'd be stuck. There is so much. He has said so much publicly, which is kind of his job. But if there's some part of you that's worried, that's curious about, well, Dana's been bored with the UFC and MMA for a little bit. I think there's some truth to that. Is he gonna, abandon us just for power slap? Is he gonna move on to politics now, if that's a possibility? I don't think so. I mean, first of all, I think Nevada just had their gubernatorial election, so he'd have to wait however long it is for them. I think it's 4 years. But each state's a little bit different with how long they let their governors sit for. So he'd have to wait for that at least to come back around. But I don't think that's impossible for him to try. There's so much baggage to that man, though, if he were to try and run. I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter, but he's also not Trump. Trump was able to get around a lot of that. And Trump has said some very crass things. Dana's on camera hitting his wife. Those are Donald Trump saying, again, very crass things that I find a little bit off-putting. And some of the things he did in his first term weren't my favorite things in the world. But all you have to do is like play the clip of Dana White hitting his wife and then like splice over the sound of him saying you don't come back from putting your hands on a woman. And you just let that hypocrisy speak for itself. And so I don't know. Anyway, got a little bit off topic there. Was there anything else on the political side that I thought maybe was worth talking about? Probably not. Those are kind of the major things. I mean, the lawsuit's going to go forward as it's going to go forward. Um, I I don't know that I don't know that anything related to that case is going to fall too much within the purview of anything Trump's necessarily going to affect, unless, big unless here, unless there's a couple of Supreme Court justices that may retire. There's a weird thing with the Supreme Court where, a judge won't necessarily retire if they think that their seat's going to be filled by the nominees for their seat will be put forward by a president they don't like. Um, at which point some of it becomes a game of like, okay, can I get someone in the White House who will put forth a nominee and can get them clear and get them confirmed, who I will agree with before I die. And that's a game of cat and mouse that rather famously, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg lost. And it's happened before. She's the most recent example. So there's a couple who are getting a little bit up there in age, and if they choose to retire and Trump is able to confirm 2 new Supreme Court justices, which is very possible, and the Johnson case, because the Lee case looks like it's going to be settled, and the Johnson case then gets decided and then appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, maybe that will have an impact, but like the judge that's currently overseeing that trial is not really going to be like, I don't think is in danger of being replaced. So in general, unless we get an appeal all the way up the chain, I doubt it really plays into it. And even then, like appealing to the Supreme Court just doesn't hear a lot of cases. There's a lot of cases that are appealed to them, and frequently they'll just go, no, we agree with the previous ruling. Um, but that's kind of the last thing that I think would bear examination. Mark Hunt's lawsuit against the UFC is going forward, and he's representing himself. And Mark Hunt is not a stupid man, contrary to what you might expect of someone who's been hit in the head as much as he has. So that's another thing we're kind of half keeping an eye on. I don't really feel like getting into the Conor McGregor civil lawsuit because, I mean, maybe when something substantial comes about after it, but at the moment it's just a lot of some moderately harrowing details about what the woman in question went through physically, and because this is a civil suit, it's gonna get a little bit ugly, and we'll just have to wait. If more comes out about that, I will obviously update if something more substantial than what's come out thus far comes out. But yeah, that's where that is. Okay, we're a little over 90 minutes. Let me check the old X machine. If nothing new is broken, we will do plugs and get out of here. Alrighty. No, don't see anything new on the MMA side of things here, so plugs. Monday, there will be a TV party tonight for the 3rd season of Ash vs. Evil Dead, 3rd and final season. That'll be at the bare minimum Mark and myself. I think we're supposed to have, Dorian and Alexis as well? Let me have a quick look. Yeah, current setup is, Mark, me, Jesse, Alexis, and Dorian. So the usual crew there. Okay, that should be decently fun. WWE SmackDown on Friday again. I will not be able to cover UFC 308 live, but I will try to get something written up or, at a bare minimum, viewed appropriately before the podcast next week. All right, that's it for me. Next week we'll be back here to review UFC 309, and we will be previewing UFC on ESPN Plus 106. They are in Macau, China. Um, Petr Yan and Davison Figueiredo is your main event. Heck yes. That's a great fight. That's a really good fight. Also on that card, Yan Xiaonan and Tabitha Ricci. That's fine. Song Kanan and Muslim Salikov. That's fine. Wang Tong, who is trying to gain some momentum against Gabriela Fernandez. All right. Volkan Oezdemir and Carlos Ulborg. All right. Zhang Mingyang and Ozzy Diaz. They're giving Zhang a very easy fight. Good grief. No one on the prelims has a Wikipedia page. Shi Bin and Zhu Kanji. Oh, Barangong Jisili and Yu Sun Yong. So that's, I assume that's Chinese, and then that's Korean. I don't know any of these people. Okay, I know Mahashate, who's and Nicholas Mata as the opening. Oh, we have 4 Road to UFC Season 3 tournament finals. Okay. I, that makes sense for the top 4 fights from this. Um, Still don't know, but okay. So, full preview next week. All right, if that makes a lot more sense, if that's being what the Road to UFC is going to. Okay. Okay. That's fine. I don't begrudge that. Road to UFC is actually pretty solid content. All right. Full preview next week. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the heck out of you. Stay safe out there as usual, and until next time, continue to be well, be safe, and behave.